Shakespeare's Richard III is historical fiction following Richard, Duke of Gloucester, in the wake of the 15th century Wars of the Roses. The following historical information is provided to assist you in making sense of the action of the play. The Wars of the Roses involved the reigning House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and led by Henry VI, whose wife or widow, Queen Margaret, appears in the play, and the opposing House of York, symbolized by a white rose, whose victory put Edward IV and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, on the throne. Both the House of Lancaster and the House of York were part of the House of Plantagenet, who ruled England from Henry II's ascent to the throne in 1154 through the death of Richard in 1485. The real Edward IV had many siblings. The two depicted in Shakespeare's Richard III are George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who became Richard III. The real Edward IV also had many children. Two sons depicted in Shakespeare's Richard III are Edward, Prince of Wales, who became Edward V briefly, and Richard, Duke of York. His daughter Elizabeth is mentioned but not depicted. To make naming just slightly more confusing, it might be helpful to note that the father of Edward IV and George and Richard was also named Richard of York. This means that there are three Richards in this history. One, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who becomes Richard III. Two, Richard, Duke of York, Richard III's father. And three, Richard, Duke of York, Richard III's nephew, the son of Edward IV. There's also an Edward, a second Edward, who is the son of George, Duke of Clarence. So there's Edward IV, and then this nephew of Edward IV, also called Edward. And then, of course, to make it more complicated, the son of Henry VI, again, who's dead at the beginning of the play, is called Edward, Prince of Wales, and he is the husband of Anne, who becomes Richard III's wife. Again, so both of those two, Henry VI and Edward, Prince of Wales, are dead at the beginning of the play. So there are four Edwards. Edward IV, brother to Richard III, who is king when the play starts. Edward, Prince of Wales, who's the dead son of the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, and husband of Anne. Edward, Prince of Wales, the son of Edward IV and nephew of Richard III, who briefly becomes Edward V. And there's an Edward, son of George, Duke of Clarence, and nephew of Richard III, who's mentioned but doesn't appear in the play. Phew! There are also a few Elizabeths to think of. One is Queen Elizabeth, who's the wife of Edward IV at the beginning of the play, and it's important to note that she's not the Queen Elizabeth the first, who ruled in her own right. The wife of Edward IV is a queen consort, and so she's not given a Roman numeral like the kings would have. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's also the daughter of Queen Elizabeth and Edward IV, who's mentioned but not depicted. So that gives us three Elizabeths to track. Then the Henrys. Henry VI is the defeated Lancastrian king at the beginning of the play, as I mentioned. And Henry VII is Henry Tudor, who is Earl of Richmond and is referred to as Richmond in the play. He's the one who defeats Richard III and becomes the king as a result of the battle that ends the War of the Roses. So it's important to maybe think about historical accuracy. It is true that Richard married Anne, which again is kind of weird. She's the widow of Richard's enemy, Edward, Prince of Wales, the son of Henry VI. But the marriage occurred much earlier than is depicted in Shakespeare's play. It's also true that Richard usurped the throne from his nephew Edward V, who with his younger brother disappeared while under Richard's protection. It's also true that Richard III was defeated at Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who became Henry VII and married Elizabeth, daughter of Edward IV. The Battle of Bosworth Field ended the Wars of the Roses, ended the claims of the houses of Lancaster and York to the throne, and is often used to date the end of the Middle Ages. It might be helpful also to note that a person called Rutland in the play is Edmund, Earl of Rutland, a brother of Edward IV, Richard and George, right, who was killed by the Lancastrians after the Battle of Wakefield in 1460. While Rutland is characterized in the play as an infant and used as an excuse for revenge on the House of Lancaster, he was 17 at the time of his death and fought alongside his father, Richard of York. One important aspect of this history is that Henry VII launched the Tudor dynasty, which continued through the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the monarch during most of Shakespeare's life. According to scholar M. Wendy Hennequin, one might see Shakespeare's depiction of Henry's restoration of order after the evils of Richard as a kind of propaganda intended to please his queen. Another interesting aspect of this history is that Richard III's remains were discovered in 2012 under a car park, and scientists at the University of Leicester have been using these remains to answer questions about Richard III's life, including the cause of his death at Bosworth Field, and how Richard III's scoliosis would have impacted his life.